What if I told you that pretty much everything you think you know about Cold War espionage is, well, wrong? That the KGB's main job wasn't about stealing secrets, but something way more patient, and honestly, way more terrifying. That's the warning we got from a man who was right on the inside of the whole Soviet propaganda machine. So, let's get right into it.
So, that was Yury Bєзмєнов, a former KGB officer, speaking back in 1984. And just think about what he's saying. Only 15% of the KGB's work was actual spying. The other 85% was psychological warfare. The real threat, he argued, wasn't some James Bond-type character. It was a massive, public campaign designed to completely change how an entire nation thinks. This is the story of his warning. But before we can really dig into the warning, we've got to understand the man who delivered it. I mean, who exactly was Yury Bєzмєнов, and why should we even listen to him?
Well, for starters, Yury Bєzmєnov wasn't some dissident from the fringes. He was a pure product of the Soviet elite. His dad was a top officer in the Soviet army. He went to the best schools, specializing in Indian culture and languages, and was basically groomed for this kind of work from day one. His official job title was journalist for the state press agency, Novosti. But in reality, that was just a cover story. His actual mission had nothing to do with reporting news. It was all about shaping the news, influencing the very people who would then go home and shape public opinion in their own countries. He had some pretty blunt names for them, calling them useful idiots or even political prostitutes. His entire job was to carefully manage their perception of reality.
I mean, listen to that. It gives you a pretty raw look at his methods, right? He said that from the moment a guest landed, he'd just start pouring the drinks. And while he only pretended to drink, the visitors, they drank a lot. It made them more agreeable, more likely to sign off on whatever was put in front of them or to swallow a propaganda line. It was manipulation, plain and simple.
But, you know, living this kind of life, a life of privilege built on lies, it came with a heavy moral price tag. And for Bezmenov, the breaking point didn't happen in Moscow. It happened thousands of miles away on a foreign posting that would change everything for him.
So he's in India and he falls in love with the country. The history, the culture, the people. The KGB actually had a term for this, split loyalty. And for an agent, it was an incredibly dangerous thing. It was in India that the gap between the ideology he was supposed to be selling and the reality he was seeing every day just became too wide to ignore. And this right here really gets to the core of his crisis. On the one hand, his official job was to push this message of Soviet friendship and progress, but on the other hand, what he saw was what he called a new kind of colonialism, one that was just brutal, exploitative, and only brought misery.
But the thing that really shattered his last illusions, the final straw, was a discovery he made working in a secret department. He found lists of influential Indians, journalists, intellectuals, people who were actually sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and they were all marked for execution once the communists eventually took over India.
So why would they do that? Well, the KGB's logic was just chillingly cynical. The so-called useful idiots, the idealists who actually believed in the cause, they were seen as the most dangerous of all. Because once they saw the brutal reality of the system they helped create, they'd obviously turned against it. So the solution was simple: get rid of them before they could. For Bezmenov, that was a line he just couldn't cross. He knew he had to get out. So after risking his own life to defect, Bezmenov basically dedicated himself to exposing the very system he used to serve. And at the absolute heart of his warning was this specific four-stage blueprint for what he called ideological subversion.
The goal here wasn't about winning an argument or proving one system was better than another. It was way more ambitious. The real goal was to slowly erode a person's ability to think critically, to create a society so confused, so bombarded with conflicting information and twisted values, that it literally can't tell what's true anymore or even recognize a threat when it's staring them in the face.
Okay, so here's how he breaks it down. 4 distinct phases. First up is demoralization. This is the slow burn, taking 15 to 20 years to corrupt a nation's values, mainly by influencing an entire generation of students. That's followed by destabilization, which is much faster, maybe 2 to 5 years, and it targets the economy, foreign policy, and defense. This chaos creates the perfect opening for stage 3, crisis, a really short, violent event that brings about a change in power. And it all ends in what he sarcastically called normalization, where the new oppressive reality just becomes, well, normal.
And here is the single most chilling part of his entire warning. Speaking back in 1984, Bezmenov said that the first and longest stage, demoralization, was already finished in the United States.
He believed a whole generation of Americans had been taught to reject their own country's values and that the process was basically irreversible at that point. So, faced with that incredibly grim diagnosis, what was Bezmenov's solution? Well, it all starts with his own dramatic escape, a story that really shows you just how far he was willing to go to sound the alarm.
You have to understand, trying to defect from India at that time was almost a suicide mission. The Indian government was tight with the Soviets, so if you got caught, you'd be handed right back to the KGB, which was a death sentence. He couldn't trust anybody, so he came up with the most insane plan he could think of, to disappear in plain sight. He literally bought a wig, put on some jeans and beads, and just blended in with a group of Western hippies. He traveled with them, smoked what he had to smoke to fit in, and just waited for his chance to slip away and get to the West. The image of this buttoned-up KGB agent turning into a flower child, it just tells you everything about how desperate he was to get his message out.
So after he finally made it to safety, his advice for the West was incredibly direct. First, he said, you have to realize you're in an undeclared war. Second, you have to educate a new generation in things like patriotism and just basic common sense. Third, he said you have to stop all aid and trade with totalitarian countries. And finally, he left everyone with this stark reminder. For those of us in the free world, there's nowhere else to run.
So Yury Bєzmєnov laid all of this out for us decades ago. He handed us a framework for subversion that he swore was being used against the West. And the question he leaves us with, the one we'll end on, isn't whether he was right or wrong back then. The question is, how does his warning about demoralization, destabilization, and the deliberate twisting of reality, how does it sound to you today?